"May I sit here?" asked the disabled girl to the biker. What he discovered shocked him. The early morning sun filtered through the diner's large windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Frank sat in his corner booth, the same spot he'd claimed as his own for the past 3 years. His weathered leather jacket creaked as he shifted in his seat, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The familiar scent of bacon and eggs wafted from the kitchen, mixing with the rich aroma of fresh coffee. It was a smell that reminded him of simpler times, back when Sarah was still alive. He pushed that thought away, like he always did, focusing instead on the steady hum of conversation from the handful of regulars scattered throughout the diner. Martha, the elderly waitress who'd been serving him since his first visit, topped off his coffee without asking. She knew his routine by now. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and wheat toast. No small talk necessary. That's why he liked this place. Nobody bothered him here. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice rough from disuse. Martha gave him a small nod and moved on to her other customers, her sensible shoes squeaking against the floor. Through the window, Frank watched as cars passed by on Main Street, their drivers rushing to wherever they needed to be. He had nowhere to be, and that's exactly how he liked it. His motorcycle waited outside, ready to take him wherever the road led, though lately he found himself staying in town more often than not. The morning light caught on his coffee cup, making the dark liquid shimmer. Frank's mind wandered to the long rides he used to take with Sarah, the wind in their faces, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. Those memories used to tear him apart, but now they just left a dull ache in his chest. The bell above the diner's door chimed, but Frank didn't look up. He never did. The sound of wheels caught his attention, though, different from the usual footsteps. Softer, mechanical. Still, he kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching a pair of sparrows hop along the sidewalk outside. His fingers tapped absently against the warm ceramic mug as he heard the wheeled sound getting closer. The regular breakfast crowd knew to leave him alone. Even Jimmy, the chatty mailman, had learned that lesson after countless failed attempts at conversation. The squeak of wheels stopped near his table. Frank could see a reflection in the window now, something purple. He took another sip of his coffee, hoping whoever it was would move along. "May I sit here?" The voice was small and hesitant, barely above a whisper. Frank turned his head, surprise breaking through his usual stoic expression. A young girl looked up at him from a bright purple wheelchair, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Her eyes were wide and hopeful, carrying none of the fear or hesitation most people showed when approaching him. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. Frank stared at the little girl, his weathered hands wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. The question had caught him off guard. Most people at the diner knew to leave him alone, and children usually stayed far away from the gruff-looking biker. The girl's purple wheelchair gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. Her small hands rested carefully in her lap, and she wore a neat blue dress with little white flowers. Despite her shy demeanor, her eyes held a spark of determination that made Frank pause. Frank cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. The girl waited patiently, her hopeful expression making him feel strangely uncomfortable. It had been years since anyone had asked to share his table. He glanced around the diner. There were plenty of empty tables, so why had she chosen his? The morning regulars were scattered about, the retired postman reading his newspaper, the young couple sharing breakfast before work, the delivery guy grabbing his usual coffee to go. Finally, Frank gave a small nod. "Sure, kid." The words felt strange coming from his mouth. The girl's face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the whole diner. She carefully maneuvered her wheelchair into the empty space across from him. Frank noticed how she handled the chair with practiced ease, though her movements were a bit slow and deliberate. Janet, the waitress who had been serving Frank his morning coffee for years, approached their table. Her familiar green apron was spotted with coffee stains, and her graying hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun. "I see you've met our Lily," Janet said warmly, placing a glass of orange juice in front of the girl without being asked. It seemed to be her usual order. Frank raised an eyebrow questioningly at Janet. The waitress's expression softened as she refilled his coffee cup. "She's been coming here with her mother for months," she explained quietly, glancing at Lily, who was now contentedly sipping her juice. "Such a sweet girl, always so polite." Janet's voice dropped even lower, meant only for Frank's ears. "Her mother passed away last month. Cancer. She lives with her grandparents now, but still comes in most mornings." Frank felt something twist in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He looked at Lily again, recognizing something in her quiet demeanor that he knew all too well. The careful way she held herself, the shadow behind her smile, they were familiar signs of loss. Lily caught him looking and gave him another small smile. Frank quickly turned his attention back to his coffee, but he could feel a crack forming in the wall he'd built around himself. He didn't want to care, didn't want to feel that familiar ache of sympathy, but something about this little girl in her purple wheelchair had managed to slip past his defenses. Janet moved away to tend to other customers, leaving Frank and Lily in an awkward silence. Frank struggled with the unfamiliar situation, not knowing what to say or do. It had been so long since he'd had a real conversation with anyone, let alone a child. He snuck another glance at Lily, who seemed content just sitting there with her orange juice. Her dark hair was neatly braided, probably by caring grandparent hands, and her small fingers traced patterns on the condensation of her glass. Despite her young age, there was something in her manner that spoke of someone who had seen too much, too soon. The familiar guilt of caring began to creep in, but Frank couldn't help feeling a connection to this quiet child who seemed to carry the weight of loss just as he did. Frank watched as Lily settled into her wheelchair across from him, her small hands carefully arranging her belongings on the table. The morning sun streaming through the diner's windows caught the silver spokes of her purple wheelchair, making them sparkle. "I have something to show you," Lily said softly, reaching into her backpack. Her movements were deliberate and careful as she pulled out a worn sketchbook with colorful stickers decorating its cover. Frank took another sip of his coffee, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to making conversation, especially with children. The pages of her sketchbook rustled as she flipped through them, her face brightening with anticipation. "Here it is," she said, turning the book around to face him. Frank nearly choked on his coffee. There on the page was an incredibly detailed pencil drawing of a man on a motorcycle. But not just any man. The leather jacket, the distinctive beard, the old Harley he'd ridden for years. It was him. The sketch captured every detail, right down to the small tear in his jacket sleeve, and the way his bandana always tilted slightly to the left. "That's..." Frank's voice trailed off as he leaned closer to examine the drawing. His weathered fingers hovered over the page, not quite touching it. The artwork showed him riding along the coastal highway, a scene he remembered clearly from 3 years ago. Someone had taken his photo that day and posted it online, but he'd never expected to see it transformed like this. "That's you," Lily finished for him, a hint of pride in her voice. Her small fingers smoothed out a corner of the page that had started to curl. "I found your picture on the internet when I was looking up motorcycles with my mom. She used to love bikes, too." Frank's throat felt tight. He glanced at the drawing again, then at Lily, trying to make sense of this strange coincidence. The detail in the sketch was remarkable. The way she'd captured the sunlight glinting off his bike's chrome, the exact pattern of clouds in the sky that day. "You drew this?" he asked, his gruff voice softer than usual. Lily nodded, her eyes bright. "I've been practicing drawing for a long time. Mom said I had a gift." She paused, her smile faltering slightly at the mention of her mother. "When I saw your picture, you looked so free, like nothing could stop you. I wanted to capture that feeling." Frank sat back in his chair, his coffee forgotten. His mind raced with questions. How had this little girl, who'd just lost her mother, found such a connection to his image? He'd spent years trying to avoid connections, trying to stay invisible. And yet here was this child who'd seen something in him worth drawing. "I've drawn it several times," Lily continued, flipping to another page to show a different version of the same scene. "Sometimes when things get hard, I imagine what it would be like to ride free like that." Frank stared at the drawings, then at the young artist across from him. His hands, usually steady from years of working on motorcycles, trembled slightly as he touched the corner of the sketchbook. Something about this moment felt bigger than him, bigger than his carefully constructed solitude. "How," he started, then cleared his throat. "How did you know I'd be here?" Lily's eyes widened. "I didn't," she said simply. "I just come here. Sometimes, like you do. Isn't that funny?" Frank nodded slowly, unable to shake the feeling that this meeting wasn't just chance. After years of riding solo, avoiding connections, this girl had somehow found him twice, first through her art, and now here in person. Frank stared at the drawing in his weathered hands. The detail was remarkable. His old Harley-Davidson, the leather jacket he always wore, even the small tear in his left sleeve. His throat felt tight. "How did you—" he started, his voice trailing off. Lily's small fingers traced the edge of her drawing. "I saw your picture in the newspaper 3 years ago. You were helping at that big charity ride for sick kids." Her voice was soft but clear. "You looked kind, even though you tried not to." Frank set the drawing down carefully on the table between them. The morning sunlight streaming through the diner's windows caught the graphite marks, making them shimmer slightly. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, but for once, Frank barely noticed it. "Do you still ride your motorcycle?" Lily asked, her eyes bright with interest. "Every day," Frank nodded, surprised by how easy the words came. "Been riding for 30 years now." "What's it like?" Lily leaned forward in her wheelchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Is it scary?" A small smile tugged at Frank's lips. "Not scary. Feels like freedom. Like you're flying low to the ground, with the wind all around you." Lily's face lit up. "I dream about that sometimes. Just going wherever I want, feeling the wind." Something in her words struck a chord in Frank's heart. He found himself telling her about his favorite routes, the quiet back roads where deer sometimes crossed his path at dawn, the mountain passes where you could see for miles. Lily listened intently, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention. "Did you always want to be a biker?" she asked, taking a small sip from her hot chocolate. Frank's hand automatically went to his coffee cup, but he didn't drink. "No, actually. Used to be an accountant, if you can believe it." He hadn't told anyone that in years. "Really?" Lily giggled, and the sound was like wind chimes. "What made you change?" Frank paused, surprised by how much he wanted to answer honestly. "After my wife passed, I needed something different. Something that made me feel alive again." Instead of the usual pity he dreaded seeing in people's eyes, Lily just nodded thoughtfully. My mom used to say that sometimes the heart needs new dreams when old ones hurt too much. Frank felt his chest tighten at her words. Before he could respond, the diner's bell chimed, and an older woman walked in. Lily's face brightened. That's my grandmother. The woman approached their table, her kind face showing both surprise and curiosity at seeing her granddaughter chatting with a gruff-looking biker. Ready to go home, sweetheart? She asked Lily, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. Lily carefully tucked her drawing back into her bag. Thank you for letting me sit with you, Mr. Frank, she said politely. As her grandmother wheeled her toward the door, Frank watched them go. The diner suddenly felt emptier than before. He could still hear Lily's gentle voice in his head, talking about dreams and wind and freedom. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was curiosity, yes, but also something more. Something that made him want to know more about this remarkable little girl who had seen kindness in him when he'd worked so hard to hide it. The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Frank pushed open the glass door, the familiar bell chiming above his head. He hadn't planned on coming back so soon, but something drew him here, like a magnet pulling at his weathered heart. His boots squeaked against the floor as he made his way to his usual corner booth. That's when he saw them, Lily and her grandparents, huddled in a booth near the window. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Lily sat in her purple wheelchair, shoulders slumped, her usual bright smile nowhere to be seen. Her grandfather, a thin man with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned close to her, speaking in hushed tones. Her grandmother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, trying to hide her tears. Come on, sweetheart, her grandfather coaxed, his voice gentle but strained. You need to eat something. Look, Janet made your favorite pancakes with extra strawberries. Lily just stared at the plate, her small hands folded in her lap. The sparkle Frank had seen in her eyes yesterday had dimmed, replaced by a distant, hollow look that made his chest ache. Janet, the waitress from yesterday, appeared at Frank's side. Your usual spot? She asked, coffee pot in hand. Frank nodded, settling into the booth behind Lily's family. He could hear everything now. The quiet sniffles, the whispered words of encouragement, the sound of untouched silverware against ceramic plates. It's just been one of those mornings, he heard the grandfather explain to Janet when she came to refill their coffee. She wouldn't take her medicine, and then the wheelchair got stuck on the porch step. Frank pretended to read his menu, but his ears stayed tuned to their conversation. He watched from the corner of his eye as Lily's grandparents exchanged worried glances, their faces etched with exhaustion. After a while, Lily's grandmother took her to the restroom, leaving the grandfather alone with Janet. Frank couldn't help but overhear their conversation, though part of him felt guilty for listening. I don't know what to do anymore, Janet, the grandfather's voice cracked. Frank saw him wipe his eyes with a paper napkin. The medical bills keep piling up. The house needs repairs we can't afford. And Lily. He paused, taking a shaky breath. She needs special therapy, equipment for the house. Things we just can't give her. Janet placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You're doing the best you can, Tom. Our best isn't enough, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Since her mother passed, it's like Lily's lost her spark. We're not equipped for this. We're too old, too tired. But what choice do we have? She's all we have left of our daughter. Frank's coffee grew cold in front of him as he listened. Each word hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of his own losses, his own struggles. He thought about Lily's drawing of him, about her bright smile yesterday, about how quickly that light had faded. The grandfather's voice grew quieter, more desperate. "We're running out of options, Janet. The insurance barely covers the basics. Some days I don't know how we'll make it to the next." Frank's hands tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white. He remembered how it felt to be overwhelmed by grief, to feel helpless in the face of loss. But hearing the raw pain in the grandfather's voice, watching Lily's silent struggle, it stirred something in him he thought had died long ago. Frank drummed his fingers on his motorcycle's handlebars, parked outside the diner. For 2 days straight, he hadn't been able to get Lily and her grandparents out of his mind. The image of her grandfather's tears, the overwhelming exhaustion in their faces. It all haunted him. He took a deep breath of the crisp morning air and walked into the diner. The bell chimed above the door, and the familiar smell of coffee wrapped around him. Sure enough, there they were, Lily and her grandparents in their usual booth. Lily's face lit up when she saw him. "Frank!" she called out, waving her small hand. Her grandmother looked up, surprised, while her grandfather nodded politely. Frank could see the dark circles under their eyes, the slight tremor in the grandmother's hands as she stirred her coffee. Frank cleared his throat and walked over to their table. His heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't used to offering help. Usually he kept to himself, lived his life alone. But something about this family pulled at him. "Morning," he said, his gruff voice softer than usual. "Been thinking. I'm pretty good with my hands. Done lots of repair work over the years." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the attention. "Noticed your fence is looking a bit rough. I could help fix it up if you'd like." The grandparents exchanged glances. Lily's grandfather sat up straighter. "That's kind of you, but we couldn't possibly." "No charge," Frank cut in. "Just want to help." He looked at Lily, who was beaming at him. "Maybe help with some groceries, too. I've got a truck. Makes it easier than trying to manage with—" He gestured vaguely at Lily's wheelchair. Lily's grandmother's eyes welled up with tears. "We're not looking for charity," she said quietly, but her voice wavered. "It's not charity," Frank replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. "It's being neighborly." The word felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't been neighborly to anyone in years. The grandfather studied Frank's face for a long moment. "The fence does need fixing," he admitted, "and the grocery runs have been getting harder." "Please, Grandpa?" Lily's voice was soft but eager. "Frank's really nice. He could teach me about motorcycles, too." A small smile cracked through the grandfather's tired face. He looked at his wife, who gave a slight nod. "Well," he said, "I suppose we could use a hand, just until we get back on our feet." Frank felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, maybe, or purpose. He wasn't sure which. "I'll start with the fence tomorrow, if that works for you." They exchanged addresses and phone numbers, something Frank hadn't done with anyone in years. As they talked, he noticed how Lily's grandparents gradually relaxed, as if some invisible weight was lifting from their shoulders. Before leaving, Frank caught a glimpse of Lily's latest drawing. It showed him fixing a fence while she sat nearby in her wheelchair, watching. Somehow she'd already known he would help. The sight made his throat tight. Walking back to his motorcycle, Frank realized just how much this family needed support. It wasn't just about fixing fences or carrying groceries. They needed someone to lean on, someone to share the load. For the first time in years, he felt needed. Really needed. And surprisingly, that didn't scare him as much as it should have. Frank wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of dirt across his weathered skin. The morning sun was getting warmer as he and Lily's grandfather finished planting the last of the tomatoes in the small garden patch. His muscles ached from the work, but it was a good kind of pain, the kind that reminded him he was doing something worthwhile. "Thank you for the help today," Lily's grandfather said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of gratitude and lingering pride. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Frank just nodded, cleaning his dirt-covered hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket. As Lily's grandfather headed inside to rest, Frank's eyes drifted to the corner of the backyard, where Lily sat under the shade of an old maple tree. Her purple wheelchair was parked on the concrete path, and she had her sketchbook balanced carefully on her lap. The garden tools could wait. Frank found himself walking toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. Lily didn't look up, completely absorbed in her drawing. Her small hand moved the pencil across the paper with careful, deliberate strokes. "Mind if I join you?" Frank asked, his gruff voice softer than usual. Lily looked up and smiled, that same warm smile that had first greeted him at the diner. She nodded, and Frank lowered himself onto the wooden bench beside her wheelchair. "What are you drawing today?" he asked, genuinely curious. Lily tilted her sketchbook slightly so he could see. On the paper was a detailed drawing of the garden they'd just finished planting. But it wasn't just the garden, as it was now. She'd drawn it full of life, with tall tomato plants heavy with fruit, butterflies floating between the leaves, and flowers in full bloom. "That's how it's going to look," she explained softly, "when everything grows." Frank studied the drawing, amazed by how much detail she'd captured. She'd even included him and her grandfather working in the garden, their figures small but recognizable. "You see things different than most folks," Frank said, running his finger along the edge of the paper. "You see what things could be, not just what they are." Lily's pencil paused mid-stroke. "Mom used to say that too." Her voice was barely above a whisper. She flipped back a few pages in her sketchbook, revealing other drawings, scenes from the diner, portraits of her grandparents, and several of Frank working on various projects around the house. Each drawing told a story, capturing moments that most people would overlook. In one, Frank was fixing the porch steps, but Lily had drawn him with a slight smile on his face, something he hadn't even realized he'd been doing. In another, she'd captured her grandfather napping in his chair, but the way she'd drawn the sunlight falling across his face made him look peaceful rather than tired. Frank felt something shift inside him as he looked at these drawings. Through Lily's eyes, the world wasn't just a collection of broken things needing to be fixed. It was full of possibility, beauty, and quiet moments of connection. Even him, a weather-beaten old biker who'd spent years running from his past, she saw something worth drawing. "These are real special, Lily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've got a gift for seeing the good in things." Lily smiled again, but this time it reached her eyes, making them sparkle. She turned to a fresh page in her sketchbook and began a new drawing, humming softly to herself. Frank sat there beside her, watching her work, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across Frank's usual corner table. The familiar scent of coffee and pancakes filled the air, but something felt different today. His eyes kept drifting to the empty space across from him, where Lily usually sat, her purple wheelchair and bright smile notably absent. Sarah, the waitress who had worked there for years, placed his usual black coffee in front of him. "Missing your breakfast, buddy?" she asked with a gentle smile. Frank shrugged, trying to maintain his gruff exterior. "Just noticed she wasn't here is all." But truth be told, he had grown accustomed to their morning chats, to watching her draw in her sketchbook while he sipped his coffee. The bell above the door chimed, and Frank's attention immediately shifted. Instead of Lily, though, he saw her grandparents, Martha and George, walking in. Their faces were drawn with worry, shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. Frank noticed George's hands trembling as he helped Martha remove her coat. Without thinking, Frank raised his hand in greeting. The couple hesitated before making their way to his table. Up close, the dark circles under their eyes were even more apparent. "Everything okay?" Frank asked, his voice gruff but concerned. "Haven't seen Lily today." Martha's eyes welled up with tears, and George placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. After a moment's hesitation, they slid into the booth across from him. "She's having a really rough time," George said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last night was difficult. She wouldn't sleep, kept saying she was scared we'd leave her like her mother did." Martha dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "We're not as young as we used to be, Frank. We love her more than anything. But her anxiety, it's getting worse. Some days she won't leave her room, won't even touch her sketchbook." George's weathered hands wrapped around an empty coffee cup that Sarah had brought over. "Yesterday she had a complete meltdown when I tried to take her to physical therapy. She was screaming, crying. We've never seen her like that before." "We're trying our best," Martha continued, her voice breaking. "But we're exhausted. Sometimes I feel like we can barely take care of ourselves, let alone give Lily everything she needs." Frank sat in silence, listening to their pain pour out. He thought about his own lonely years after losing his wife, how he'd chosen isolation over connection. Now, watching these good people struggle to care for their granddaughter, something stirred in his heart. "The worst part," George added, his voice thick with emotion, "is feeling like we're failing her. Her mother would have known what to do. We're at our breaking point." Frank's calloused. Hands tightened around his coffee cup. He thought about Lily's drawings, her quiet strength, the way she'd somehow managed to break through his own walls. Looking at her grandparents' tired faces, he made a decision. "I want to help," he said firmly. "Whatever you need. I know I'm just some old biker who showed up in your lives, but I mean it. You don't have to do this alone." Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand, tears flowing freely now. "You don't know what that means to us, Frank. Just having someone else care about Lily, it means everything." Frank sat at his kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. Coffee grew cold in his favorite mug as he scrolled through web page after web page. His weathered hands, more used to gripping handlebars than typing on keyboards, moved slowly across the keys. "There's gotta be something," he muttered, running a hand through his gray hair. The morning sun filtered through his window as he searched for resources about children with disabilities. His eyes felt tired, but he couldn't stop. Every time he thought about giving up, Lily's gentle smile pushed him forward. He grabbed a notepad and started writing things down. Physical therapy programs, support groups for kids who'd lost parents, art therapy sessions. The list grew longer as he dug deeper into local resources. "Swimming therapy," he mumbled, jotting it down. "Might help with her mobility." His phone rang, startling him. It was Martha, one of the diner waitresses who knew Lily well. "Frank, you asked about places that might help Lily?" "Yeah," he said, sitting up straighter. "Found some stuff online, but—" "There's this community center on Oak Street," Martha said. "My nephew goes there. They've got all sorts of programs for kids with special needs." Frank grabbed his pen. "Oak Street, you said?" "The Rainbow Community Center. They're good people, Frank. They work with families who can't afford much, too." After hanging up, Frank looked up. The center online. Their website showed pictures of kids playing, doing art, and participating in therapy sessions. His heart lifted when he saw they had wheelchair-accessible facilities and specially trained staff. He picked up his phone again, his fingers hovering over the keypad. Making calls wasn't his thing. He preferred the solitude of the open road, the simplicity of fixing things with his hands. But Lily's face flashed in his mind again, her quiet determination, her hidden struggles. Taking a deep breath, he dialed the number. Rainbow Community Center, this is Sarah speaking. How can I help you? Frank cleared his throat. Name's Frank Morrison. I'm calling about... Well, there's this little girl. His voice grew stronger as he explained Lily's situation. He told Sarah about the young artist in the purple wheelchair, about her grandparents' struggles, about the loss of her mother. The words came easier than he expected. We'd love to help, Sarah said warmly. Could you come in to discuss this further? We have several programs that might be perfect for Lily. Sure, Frank said, relief flooding through him. When? They set up a meeting for the following morning. As Frank hung up the phone, he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. This was way outside his comfort zone. Meetings, paperwork, talking to strangers about feelings and needs. But something had changed in him since that first morning when Lily had asked to sit at his table. He looked at his notes, at all the possibilities he'd discovered. Swimming therapy, art classes, support groups. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the help Lily and her grandparents needed. Frank closed his laptop and grabbed his jacket. The community center was just a few blocks away. He could drive by just to see the place before tomorrow's meeting. As he headed for his motorcycle, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The community center stood before them, its bright red brick walls, welcoming in the morning sun. Frank parked his motorcycle in the lot, watching as Lily's grandparents helped her out of their old station wagon. His hands felt sweaty against his leather jacket as he walked toward them. Ready, kiddo? Frank asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lily nodded, her small hands gripping the wheels of her purple wheelchair. Her grandfather, Tom, looked tired but hopeful as they made their way to the entrance. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and the sound of laughter echoed from somewhere down the hall. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair approached them, clipboard in hand. You must be Lily, she said, kneeling to meet the girl's eye level. I'm Ms. Martinez. We spoke on the phone yesterday, Mr. Anderson. She smiled at Frank, who shifted uncomfortably at being addressed so formally. Just Frank is fine, he mumbled. Ms. Martinez led them through the building, pointing out different activity rooms and therapy spaces. Frank noticed how Lily's eyes lit up when they passed an art room filled with easels and bright supplies. We have several programs that could benefit Lily, Ms. Martinez explained, settling them into a cozy office. Our physical therapy department can work with her mobility needs, and we have wonderful art therapy sessions that many of our children find helpful for expressing their emotions. Frank watched as Lily's grandmother, Martha, wiped away tears. We've been trying so hard on our own, she whispered. We just didn't know where to turn. Ms. Martinez placed a gentle hand on Martha's shoulder. That's why we're here. You're not alone anymore. They spent the next hour discussing schedules, programs, and financial assistance options. Frank listened intently, asking questions about transportation and timing. His heart felt lighter with each solution they found. We can start next week, Ms. Martinez said, handing them a folder of information. And don't worry about the costs. We have several grants that can help cover everything. Lily, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, suddenly spoke up. Can I show my drawings here? Of course, sweetie, Ms. Martinez beamed. In fact, we have an art show coming up next month. Would you like to participate? Lily's face broke into a wide smile, and she looked at Frank with excitement dancing in her eyes. It was the brightest he'd seen her since they'd met. As they walked back to the parking lot, Tom pulled Frank aside. His weathered face crumpled with emotion. "We can't thank you enough," he said, his voice thick. "We've been so lost since Sarah, since our daughter passed. Having you step in like this—" He trailed off, unable to continue. Martha joined them, wrapping her arms around her husband. "You've given us hope again," she said simply. Frank felt his chest tighten with unfamiliar emotions. He watched Lily examining a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower, her face peaceful. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. "I want to help more," he found himself saying. "Whatever you need, I'm here." The words surprised him, but they felt right. Looking at Lily's small figure in her purple wheelchair, Frank realized he was ready to be part of something bigger than himself again. He just wasn't quite sure what that meant, or where this path would lead. The spring sun warmed Frank's leather jacket as he pushed Lily's wheelchair along the park path. Cherry blossoms dotted the ground like pink snow, and birds chirped their morning songs from the trees above. Frank had been taking Lily out more often lately, giving her grandparents some much-needed rest. "Want to stop here?" Frank asked, pointing to a wooden bench near a small pond. "Good spot for drawing." Lily nodded, clutching her sketchbook closer to her chest. Frank helped position her wheelchair next to the bench and sat down beside her. He watched as she opened her sketchbook to a fresh page, her small hands moving with careful precision across the paper. "What are you drawing today?" Frank asked, leaning over slightly to peek at her work. "The ducks," Lily said softly, her pencil moving in gentle strokes. Two mallards floated peacefully on the pond's surface, creating tiny ripples in their wake. Frank noticed how Lily's drawings had gotten more detailed since he'd first met her. The ducks were taking shape on the paper, complete with carefully shaded feathers and reflections in the water. He'd learned to be patient during these quiet moments, letting Lily work at her own pace. "You're getting really good at this," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. Lily paused her drawing, her pencil hovering above the paper. "Mom used to say that too." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Frank's heart tightened. It was the first time Lily had mentioned her mother to him directly. He stayed quiet, giving her space to continue if she wanted to. After a long moment, Lily spoke again. "She used to take me to the park, too." Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped her pencil tighter. "But then she got sick, and—" Her voice cracked. Frank placed his weathered hand gently on the arm of her wheelchair. "It's okay, kiddo. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." Lily shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "Everyone leaves," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Mom left, and now Grandma and Grandpa are so tired all the time." She looked up at Frank, her eyes full of fear. "What if they leave too?" Frank felt like someone had punched him in the gut. He'd known Lily was struggling, but hearing her voice, these fears made his heart ache. He turned on the bench to face her properly, his expression serious but gentle. "Listen to me, Lily," he said softly. "Your grandparents love you very much. They're not going anywhere. They're just tired sometimes, and that's why I'm here to help." "But what about you?" Lily asked, her lower lip trembling. "Will you leave too?" Frank took a deep breath, surprised by how much her question affected him. He thought about all the years he'd spent alone after his wife died, riding from town to town, never staying anywhere too long. But something was different now. This little girl had somehow worked her way into his heart. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, meaning every word. "I promise." Lily studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of doubt. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his large, calloused hand in her small one. Frank gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and they sat there in comfortable silence, watching the ducks glide across the pond. The drawing lay forgotten in Lily's lap, but something more important had taken place. Frank felt it in his bones, a shift, a deepening of their connection. He might have started helping Lily's family out of a sense of duty, but now he knew he'd stay because he wanted to, because somehow this brave little girl had become important to him, in a way he hadn't expected. Frank sat in his usual corner at the diner, his coffee growing cold. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. His weathered hands wrapped around the coffee mug, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about Lily and her grandparents. The past few weeks had been different. Instead of his usual solitary routine, he'd found himself deeply involved in their lives. He'd fixed their leaky roof, drove Lily to her therapy sessions, and spent countless hours listening to her stories. But today, something felt heavy in his chest. "What if I mess this up?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He thought about his wife, about how he couldn't save her, and now here he was, trying to save someone else's family. The familiar clink of coffee cups and the soft chatter of other customers filled the air, but Frank felt isolated in his thoughts. He remembered the promise he'd made to Lily, that he wouldn't leave. The words echoed in his mind, mixing with old memories of loss and loneliness. Janet, the waitress who'd known him for years, noticed his troubled expression. She'd been watching him since he walked in, noting how he barely touched his breakfast. Making her way over, she topped off his coffee without asking. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world today, Frank," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Her familiar presence was comforting, even though he usually preferred being alone. Frank sighed, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I don't know if I can do this, Janet," he admitted quietly. "These people, Lily and her grandparents, they're starting to depend on me." Janet waited patiently as Frank gathered his thoughts. "What happens if I fail them? What if I'm not what they need?" His voice was rough with emotion. "I couldn't even—" He trailed off, thinking about his wife's final days. "You've been coming here for years, Frank," Janet said, adjusting her apron. "Always alone, always keeping to yourself. But these past few weeks, I've seen you smile more than I have in all those years combined." Frank looked up at her, surprised by her observation. "I see how you are with that little girl," Janet continued. "The way you listen to her, the way you make sure she feels heard. That's not nothing, Frank." "But is it enough?" he asked, voicing his deepest fear. I'm just an old biker. What do I know about helping a family like that?" Janet leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes, Frank, being there is enough. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to show up." Frank rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the roughness of his beard. "I don't know, Janet. Every time I think about the long term, about really being there for them, I get this knot in my stomach, like I'm waiting for everything to fall apart." "That's fear talking," Janet said gently. "The same fear that's kept you riding solo all these years." She stood up, straightening her apron. "Nobody's asking you to be perfect, Frank. They just need you to be you." Frank nodded slowly, but the doubt still lingered in his eyes. He stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl, wondering if he was strong enough to face this new chapter in his life. or if he was setting himself up for another heartbreak. Janet gave him a sympathetic pat on the shoulder before heading back to work, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts and his cooling coffee, still unsure if he was truly capable of being what Lily and her family needed him to be. The neon sign of the diner flickered against the darkening sky as Frank nursed his third cup of coffee. The ceramic mug felt warm against his weathered hands, but the comfort it usually brought was absent tonight. Sarah, the evening waitress, approached his table with a concerned look on her face. "Frank, I heard about Lily today," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Her grandmother called earlier to cancel their usual dinner order." Frank's shoulders tensed. "What happened?" Sarah sighed, adjusting her apron. "Lily had a rough day. She refused to go to her therapy session. Threw quite a fit from what I heard. Been acting out at home, too." The news hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He'd thought things were improving. The community center had been so promising, and Lily had seemed more open lately. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath his palm. "I thought," he started, then shook his head. "I thought we were making progress." "These things take time," Sarah said gently. "You can't fix everything overnight." But Frank wasn't listening anymore. His mind wandered to all the times he'd failed in his life, his marriage after his wife got sick, the relationships he'd let slip away, the years he'd spent running from his problems on his motorcycle. Now he was failing Lily, too. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "I'm just some old biker who can't even sort out his own life." The coffee in his cup had gone cold. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows through the diner's windows. Frank stood up, leaving a few bills on the table. "I should check on them," he said, though his voice carried none of its usual determination. The ride to Lily's grandparents' house felt longer than usual. When he arrived, the porch light was on, but the house seemed unusually quiet. He knocked on the door, and Lily's grandmother answered, looking exhausted. "Oh, Frank," she said, her voice strained. "Come in." Inside, he found Lily's grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. The house felt heavy with tension and fatigue. "She won't come out of her room," her grandmother explained, wringing her hands. "Hasn't eaten dinner. We've tried everything." Frank stood there, feeling helpless. The confidence he'd built over the past few weeks seemed to crumble around him, but something in him wouldn't let him walk away. Not this time. "Would it be okay if—" He hesitated, then continued. "If I took her out for ice cream? Maybe she just needs a change of scenery." Lily's grandparents exchanged a look. Her grandfather nodded slowly. "You can try," he said. "But Frank—" He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "We don't know what to do anymore. Some days are good, but days like today—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Frank walked toward Lily's room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He could hear soft sniffling from behind the closed door. His hand hovered over the doorknob as doubt crept in. What could he, a lonely old biker, possibly say to help? What right did he have to try? But he remembered Lily's smile when she showed him her drawings, the way her eyes lit up when he told her stories about his motorcycle adventures. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he had to try. He had to reach her somehow. Taking a deep breath, he knocked gently on her door. Frank pulled his truck into the small parking lot near the city park. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground equipment, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Lily sat quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on her lap where she nervously twisted the corner of her sketchbook. "Want to sit by the pond?" Frank asked, his voice softer than usual. When Lily nodded, he helped her into her wheelchair and guided her along the paved path to their favorite spot. They found a quiet place under an old oak tree. Frank settled onto a wooden bench while Lily positioned her wheelchair beside him. For a while, they just watched the ducks glide across the water, neither speaking. "You know," Frank began, his weathered hands clasped together, "I wasn't always this quiet and lonely." He paused, feeling the weight of memories he rarely shared. "I used to laugh a lot more. Sarah, that was my wife. She could make me laugh like nobody else could." Lily looked up at him, her eyes curious and attentive. "When she got sick," Frank continued, his voice growing thick, "I didn't know what to do. I felt so helpless watching her slip away. After she was gone, I thought the best thing to do was to run away from everything and everyone. I jumped on my motorcycle and just rode." He glanced down at Lily, who was watching him intently. "I thought if I kept moving, the pain wouldn't catch up to me. But that's not how it works. The pain stays with you until you face it." Lily's small hand reached out and touched his arm. "Did you miss her very much?" "Every single day," Frank admitted. "Still do. But I made a mistake by keeping it all locked up inside. I never told anyone how much it hurt." Lily's lower lip trembled slightly. "I miss my mom too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sometimes I wake up and forget she's gone. Then I remember, and it hurts all over again." Frank noticed her shoulders beginning to shake. "That's exactly how it feels," he said gently. "Everyone keeps saying I need to be brave," Lily continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I don't want to be brave anymore. I want my mom back. I'm scared Grandma and Grandpa will leave me too. I'm scared you'll leave." Her voice cracked on the last word. Frank reached out and took her small hand in his. "It's okay not to be brave all the time, Lily. It's okay to cry." As if his words had unlocked something deep inside her, Lily's tears began to fall freely. Her small body shook with sobs that seemed too big for her tiny frame. Frank held her hand firmly, letting her know he was there, letting her finally release all the pain she'd been holding inside. "I miss her so much," she sobbed. "I miss her hugs and her voice and the way she used to sing to me at night. I miss everything about her." Frank felt his own eyes growing wet as he watched this brave little girl finally allow herself to grieve. He understood now, really understood, the depth of her pain and fears. It mirrored his own loss in so many ways, but she was just a child trying to carry an adult's burden. They sat there together, hand in hand, as Lily's tears continued to fall. Frank didn't try to stop them or offer empty words of comfort. He simply held her hand, providing the steady presence she needed while she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss. Frank sat at the kitchen table with Lily's grandparents, Mary and George. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across their worried faces. Steam rose from their coffee cups, but none of them had taken a sip. The weight of their conversation hung heavy in the air. "We're trying our best," George said, his voice cracking. He wrapped his weathered hands around his coffee mug. "But sometimes I wonder if our best is good enough for Lily." Mary reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. "The therapy sessions help, but there are days when she won't talk to anyone, not even me." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Yesterday she locked herself in her room for hours." Frank nodded, understanding their concern. He'd seen how exhausted they were, trying to balance Lily's needs with their own limitations. "You're doing more than you realize," he said softly. "Lily needs stability, and you've given her that." "But what if it's not enough?" George's shoulders slumped. "We're not getting any younger, Frank. And Lily, she needs more than just two old folks who can barely keep up." Frank leaned forward, his usual gruff exterior softening. Listen, I've seen how much love you have for that girl. That's worth more than you know." Mary wiped away another tear. "We're scared, Frank. Every time she has a bad day, every time she withdraws, it feels like we're failing her mother's memory." "You're not failing anyone," Frank said firmly. He thought about his own journey, how helping Lily had given him purpose again. "Look, I know I'm just some old biker who showed up in your lives, but I've seen how Lily responds to both of you. She feels safe here." George shook his head. "But the financial strain, her medical bills, the therapy sessions, we're barely making ends meet." "That's why we need to work together," Frank said. "I've been thinking about this a lot. The community center has more programs we haven't explored yet. There's a support group for grandparents raising children with special needs, and He paused, gathering his courage. "I want to be here for the long haul, if you'll let me." Mary looked up, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "You mean that?" "I do." Frank's voice was firm. "Between the three of us, we can create a proper support system for Lily. We all bring something different to the table." George straightened, in his chair. "You've already done so much, Frank. The way you connect with her, it's something special." "That's just it," Frank said. "We all have something special to offer her. Your love and stability, well, whatever it is she sees in this old biker." He managed a small smile. "Together, we can make sure she has everything she needs." Mary reached across the table and squeezed Frank's hand. "You don't know what this means to us." "I think I do," Frank replied, thinking of how Lily had changed his own life. "We're not alone in this anymore. Any of us." George nodded, and for the first time that afternoon, his face showed relief rather than worry. "Together, then?" "Together," Frank agreed, his determination stronger than ever. Despite his own doubts and fears, he knew this was where he needed to be. Lily had given him a second chance at having a family, and he wasn't about to let that slip away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the diner's worn linoleum floors. Frank nursed his coffee. His thoughts drifted to Lily, and a small smile tugged at his weathered face. These past few weeks had changed something in him. He wasn't just the gruff biker anymore, showing up to fix things or run errands. He had become something more. Frank pulled out his wallet and looked at the drawing Lily had given him yesterday. A purple crayon masterpiece of him teaching her how to plant flowers in her grandmother's garden. Below it, in wobbly letters, she had written, "Thank you for being my friend." The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Lily wheeled herself in, her grandmother following close behind. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Frank. "You're here!" Lily exclaimed, rolling toward his table. "Always am, kiddo," Frank replied, his gruff voice softening. He helped her position her wheelchair at the table, something that had become second nature to him now. Lily's grandmother smiled warmly. "Frank, would you mind watching her for an hour? I need to pick up her prescriptions." "Course not," he said, already reaching for the coloring books he now kept in his motorcycle saddlebag. It felt natural now, having these little things on hand for Lily. As her grandmother left, Lily pulled out her sketchbook. "Can we go to the garden after breakfast? I want to check on our flowers." Frank nodded, watching her carefully color within the lines. He remembered how scared he'd been at first, worried he'd say the wrong thing or somehow make things worse. But now, being there for Lily felt as natural as breathing. After breakfast, they headed to the small garden behind her grandparents' house. Frank had built her a special raised bed where she could reach the plants from her wheelchair. They had planted marigolds together, and Lily checked on them every day. "Look!" Lily pointed excitedly at a tiny yellow bud. "It's starting to bloom." Frank knelt beside her wheelchair, Sure is, just like you said it would. Lily's smile faded slightly. Frank, can I ask you something? Anything, sweetheart. Are you going to stay? Like, really stay? Her voice was small, vulnerable. Frank's heart tightened in his chest. He turned to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers. Lily, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. You know how these flowers need water and sunshine to grow? She nodded. Well, people need things too. They need love and friendship and someone to count on. I want to be that person for you if you'll let me. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. Like a dad? Frank's throat grew tight. Yeah, like a dad. I might not be perfect at it, but I promise I'll always be here. Lily reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones. They sat quietly together, watching the marigolds dance in the breeze, their bright yellow heads nodding in the morning sun. No more words were needed. The simple act of being there, of holding hands and sharing the peaceful moment, said everything that needed to be said. Frank squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth of connection that had been missing from his life for so long. In helping Lily heal, he had found his own healing too. The morning sun filtered through the community center's windows, casting warm patches of light across the therapy room's colorful walls. Frank sat in the waiting area, his weathered hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. Through the observation window, he watched as Lily worked with her therapist, Ms. Thompson. Lily's purple wheelchair was parked beside a low table where she was drawing. Her face showed concentration as she worked, something Frank hadn't seen in weeks. The tension that usually lined her small shoulders seemed less pronounced today. She's making remarkable progress, Ms. Thompson had told him earlier. The consistency in her routine and the support system you've all created are making a real difference. Frank nodded, remembering how different things had been just a month ago. The community center had become a second home for Lily. 3 times a week, she attended therapy sessions, art classes, and support groups with other children. The structured schedule gave her something to look forward to, and slowly but surely, her smile began to appear more often. Her grandparents noticed the change too. Last week, her grandmother had called Frank in tears, happy tears this time. She asked to help me bake cookies yesterday, she'd said. She hasn't wanted to do that since her mother passed. Now, as Frank watched Lily interact with her therapist, he could see small but significant changes. She was more engaged, making eye contact more frequently, and even laughing occasionally. The breakthrough had come gradually, like sunshine after a long storm. The community center staff had become part of their extended family. They knew exactly how to approach Lily on her difficult days, and celebrated her victories, no matter how small. Even the receptionist, Maria, kept a special drawer of stickers just for Lily, knowing how much she loved collecting them. Frank shifted in his chair as Lily finished her session. She wheeled herself out of the therapy room, clutching a new drawing in her lap. Her face lit up when she saw him waiting. "Look what I made," she said, holding up the paper. It was a drawing of their little group, her grandparents, Frank, and herself, all standing in front of the community center. The details were impressive. Her grandmother's favorite flowered dress, her grandfather's wire-rimmed glasses, and even Frank's leather jacket. "That's beautiful, kiddo," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "You got my beard just right." Lily giggled, a sound that still surprised him with its lightness. "Ms. Thompson says I can put it up on the wall with the other kids' artwork." As they made their way to the center's exit, they passed the bulletin board where families posted their success stories. Lily paused, looking at the photos and notes with interest, something she would have been too anxious to do just weeks ago. "Can we stop for ice cream on the way home?" she asked, a hint of mischief in her voice. Frank pretended to consider it seriously. "Well, I suppose we could, but only if you promise to get chocolate this time, instead of that boring vanilla." "Vanilla isn't boring," Lily protested, but she was smiling. As they headed toward the parking lot where Frank's truck waited, he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The community center had been exactly what they needed, not just for Lily, but for all of them. It had given them structure, support, and most importantly, hope. Looking down at Lily as she chatted about her session, Frank saw something he hadn't noticed before. Resilience. She was still the same quiet, thoughtful girl, but there was a new strength in her eyes, a willingness to face each day with courage. Frank sat in his favorite chair at home, an old, leather recliner that had seen better days. The evening sun filtered through his window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. His weathered hands held Lily's latest drawing, a colorful sketch of him teaching her how to plant flowers in her grandparents' garden. A small smile tugged at his lips as he remembered how different his life had been just months ago. Back then, his days had stretched out empty and meaningless, filled with nothing but long rides on his motorcycle and quiet meals at the diner. He'd wake up alone, spend his days alone, and go to bed alone, carrying the heavy weight of grief like a shadow that never left his side. But now? Now his phone would buzz with text messages from Lily's grandparents, updating him about her therapy sessions or asking when he'd next come by. His calendar, once empty except for basic maintenance on his bike, was now filled with appointments and reminders. Lily's art class on Tuesdays, physical therapy on Thursdays, and weekend visits to the park. Frank leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep breath. The silence in his home no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it was peaceful, filled with memories of Lily's laughter and the satisfaction of knowing he'd made a difference in someone's life. He thought about how Lily had changed too. She smiled more now, real smiles that reached her eyes. At the community center, her therapist had remarked on her progress, noting how she was opening up more in group sessions. Just yesterday, she'd helped another child who was struggling with similar fears, showing a strength that made Frank's chest swell with pride. Getting up from his chair, Frank walked over to his dresser, where a silver frame held a photograph of Sarah, his late wife. The picture showed her in their garden, her favorite sun hat tilted at an angle, her smile bright and loving. He picked up the frame, his thumb gently brushing across the glass. "You always said I needed to let people in," he whispered to the photograph. "Guess it just took an 8-year-old girl in a purple wheelchair to prove you right." Frank remembered how Sarah had always been the one to reach out to others, to offer help without hesitation. She would have loved Lily, he thought, would have probably been the first one to sit with her at that diner table, to draw pictures with her and share stories. Looking at Sarah's photograph now, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace with his past. The grief was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Instead of drowning in memories of what he'd lost, he found himself grateful for what he'd found. A purpose, a reason to get up each morning, and a chance to be the kind of man Sarah had always believed he could be. He set the photograph back on the dresser, adjusting it slightly. The last rays of sunlight caught Sarah's smile, and for a moment Frank could almost hear her voice, soft and sure, telling him she was proud. Proud that he'd finally opened his heart again. Proud that he'd found the courage to care for others. Proud of the man he'd become. In the quiet of his home, Frank realized that by helping Lily heal, he had somehow found his own healing too. His life, once defined by loss and loneliness, now held meaning and connection. And somewhere, he knew, Sarah was smiling. Frank sat at his usual spot in the diner, his coffee growing cold as he watched Lily's grandparents approach his table. Their faces looked different now, less weary, more hopeful. Martha, Lily's grandmother, carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Frank," Tom, the grandfather, began, pulling out a chair. "We needed to talk to you." His voice was thick with emotion. Frank straightened in his seat, his weathered hands clasping the coffee mug. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across their familiar booth. "These past few months," Martha said, sliding the package across the table, "you've been our angel. I know that sounds silly to say to a big, tough biker like yourself." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "But that's exactly what you've been." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unused to such praise. He looked down at the package but didn't touch it. "Open it," Tom encouraged, his arm around his wife's shoulders. With careful movements, Frank unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound album. As he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. The first page showed one of Lily's drawings, the one she'd made of him on his motorcycle, the same one she'd shown him that first day at the diner. "Keep going," Martha whispered. Page after page revealed more of Lily's artwork. There were drawings of Frank fixing their fence, tending to the garden with Tom, sitting with Lily at the park. Each picture captured moments he hadn't even realized were special until seeing them through Lily's eyes. "She sees you, Frank," Tom said quietly. "Really sees you. And because of you, she's starting to see herself differently, too." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "The therapy sessions are helping, but it's more than that. You've given her something we couldn't, a sense of security, of having someone strong in her corner." Martha reached across the table, placing her hand on Frank's arm. "We see the change in her every day. She smiles more, talks more. She's not as afraid anymore." Frank ran his fingers over one of the drawings, a simple sketch of him and Lily sitting on a park bench, sharing ice cream. He remembered that day clearly. It was right after one of her tough therapy sessions. "I don't know what to say," Frank admitted, his voice rougher than usual. "You don't have to say anything," Martha assured him. "We just wanted you to know what a difference you've made. Not just for Lily, but for all of us." Frank felt something shift inside him, like an old wound finally beginning to heal. He thought about the years he'd spent running from his grief, using his motorcycle as an escape. Yet here he was, finding purpose in the very thing he'd been afraid of, connecting with people again. "Truth is," Frank said, clearing his throat, "Lily's done more for me than I could ever do for her." Tom nodded knowingly. "That's how love works, Frank. It heals both ways." Frank closed the album gently, his calloused fingers lingering on its cover. The weight of it felt right in his hands, like the weight of belonging somewhere, of being needed. He realized that in trying to help this little girl and her family, he'd found his way back to himself. Martha squeezed his arm once more before standing. "We'll see you Sunday for dinner." Frank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As they walked away, he opened the album again, letting Lily's drawings tell their story. Each page reminded him that sometimes the best healing comes when you stop running and start caring about someone else. The evening sun cast a warm, golden glow through the kitchen windows of Lily's grandparents' house. The aroma of fresh-baked chicken pot pie filled the small space as Frank helped set the table, placing mismatched plates that somehow seemed perfect together. "Need any help with that, Martha?" Frank called to Lily's grandmother, who was pulling the steaming pie from the oven. "I've got it," she replied with a smile that reached her eyes. "But you could help Lily with her napkin." Frank turned to see Lily struggling to spread her napkin across her lap, her small hands working carefully but not quite managing it. Without a word, he stepped over and helped her straighten it out. "Thanks, Frank," Lily said softly, her eyes bright. She had been drawing earlier, and there was still a smudge of colored pencil on her cheek that made him smile. George, Lily's grandfather, emerged from the hallway carrying a pitcher of lemonade. "Just like my Helen used to make," he said proudly, setting it down on the table. "She taught Martha the recipe years ago." The mention of Lily's mother didn't bring the usual heavy silence that it once did. Instead, Lily smiled, reaching for her glass. "Mom always put extra lemons in mine." "That she did," Martha agreed, bringing the pot pie to the table. "She knew exactly how you liked everything, didn't she?" Frank watched as they all settled into their seats. The kitchen was small, and their elbows bumped occasionally as they passed dishes around, but nobody seemed to mind. It felt natural, comfortable, like family. "Remember to blow on it first, sweetie," Martha reminded Lily as she served her a portion of the pie. "It's still hot." Frank caught himself automatically reaching to cut Lily's piece into smaller bites, something he'd started doing weeks ago without even thinking about it. He paused, realizing how naturally these little gestures of care had become part of his routine. "Frank," Lily tugged at his sleeve, "tell them about the time your motorcycle broke down in Texas." "Again?" George chuckled, spooning vegetables onto his plate. "She loves that story." "Well," Frank began, his gruff voice softening as it always did when he told stories to Lily. "There I was, middle of nowhere, Texas sun beating down." As he told the familiar tale, he noticed how Lily mouthed along with certain parts, how Martha and George exchanged knowing looks, and how the whole kitchen seemed to fill with warmth that had nothing to do with the oven. Lily giggled at all the right moments, even though she'd heard the story countless times. Her laughter, once so rare, now came easily and often. Frank remembered the first time he'd heard it, how it had caught him off guard, how it had cracked something open in his chest that he thought had been sealed shut forever. "And then," Frank continued, gesturing with his fork, "that old rancher says to me, 'Son, that ain't a motorcycle, that's a heap of trouble on wheels.'" The whole table erupted in laughter, even though they all knew the punchline was coming. Lily's giggles mixed with Martha's gentle chuckle and George's hearty guffaw. Frank found himself laughing too, not just at the story, but at the simple joy of sharing a meal with people who had somehow become precious to him. As their laughter settled, Frank looked around the table, at Lily's bright eyes, at Martha's serene smile, at George's relaxed shoulders, and felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd carried since losing his wife didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. In trying to help this family heal, he'd found his own heart mending in ways he never expected. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees as Frank, Lily, and her grandparents spread out their picnic blanket. It was a perfect Sunday afternoon, the kind that usually brought smiles to everyone's faces. Frank had suggested the outing after noticing how well Lily had been doing lately with her therapy sessions. "Would you like some lemonade, sweetheart?" Lily's grandmother asked, pulling out a thermos from their wicker basket. Lily nodded, her fingers busy with her latest sketch. Frank watched her with pride, noticing how steady her hands had become over the past few months. But then something changed. A group of children ran past their picnic spot, laughing and playing tag. Lily's pencil stopped moving. Frank noticed the shift immediately. Her shoulders tensed, and her eyes followed the other children with a mixture of longing and sadness. He'd seen this look before, in the early days when they first met. "Everything okay, kiddo?" Frank asked softly, scooting closer to her on the blanket. Lily's lower lip trembled. She set her sketchbook down and stared at her hands. "I can't run like them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the park's ambient noise. "I'll never be able to play like that." Her grandfather reached out to comfort her, but Lily turned away, tears welling up in her eyes. "I hate this," she burst out, pushing her sketchbook away. "I hate being different. I hate that Mom left me. I hate everything." The outburst caught everyone off guard. Lily's grandmother's hand flew to her mouth, and her grandfather looked helplessly at Frank. They'd all gotten so used to Lily's progress that this sudden regression felt like a punch to the gut. Frank took a deep breath, remembering what the therapist had said about emotional setbacks being normal. He moved closer to Lily, making sure to stay in her line of sight, but not crowding her. "Hey," he said gently, picking up her discarded sketchbook. "Remember this drawing you showed me when we first met? The one of me on my motorcycle?" Lily sniffled, but nodded. "You know what I see when I look at this?" Frank continued, his voice steady and warm. "I see something nobody else in this park can do. Those kids running around? They couldn't draw like this if they tried for 100 years. He carefully turned to a fresh page in her sketchbook. "We're all different, Lily. And sometimes being different feels really hard. But you know what? Being different is what makes you special." Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But why did Mom have to leave? Was it because I'm different?" Frank's heart ached at her words. He moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your mom didn't leave because of you, sweetheart. Sometimes really sad things happen that we can't control. But look around you now." He gestured to her grandparents, who were watching with tears in their eyes. "You have so many people who love you exactly as you are." Lily's breathing began to steady as she looked up at Frank. "Even with my bad days?" "Especially with your bad days," Frank answered firmly. "These feelings you're having, they're just like waves in the ocean. Sometimes they're big and scary, but they always pass. And you know what? I'm right here to help you ride them out." The tension in Lily's shoulders began to ease. She leaned against Frank's arm, picking up her pencil again. "Will you tell me about one of your bad days?" she asked quietly. Frank smiled, remembering how far they'd both come. "Of course I will. Because that's what family does. We share our stories, even the hard ones, and we help each other through the tough times." As Lily settled back into her drawing, Frank exchanged knowing looks with her grandparents. This moment, though difficult, had only strengthened their bond. Sometimes it took a step backward to move forward, and Frank was committed to being there for every step of Lily's journey. The morning sun streamed through the living room windows, casting a warm glow on Lily's face as she sat in her purple wheelchair. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sketchbook, and her eyes darted between Frank and her grandparents, who were seated on the worn couch across from her. I want to say something," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grandmother reached out and squeezed her grandfather's hand, both of them leaning forward slightly. Frank sat in his usual chair, the one by the window where he often watched Lily draw. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and his usual stern expression had softened as he watched the young girl gather her courage. "The therapist said it's good to tell people how you feel," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger. "And I've been keeping everything inside for so long." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Since Mom died, I've been scared that everyone would leave me." Her grandfather's eyes welled up with tears, but he remained silent, letting her speak. Frank felt his own throat tighten as he watched this brave little girl open her heart. "But you all stayed," Lily said, her face brightening. "Grandma and Grandpa, you took me in even though it was hard. You never gave up on me, even when I was difficult." She turned to look at her grandparents, who were now both crying softly. "And Frank," she said, wheeling herself closer to where he sat. You came into our lives when we needed help the most. You fixed things around the house, but more importantly, you fixed something in me. She pulled out a drawing from her sketchbook. It was a new one, showing Frank standing beside her wheelchair, both of them smiling. I used to think I was alone, that no one could understand how I felt, Lily continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. But you showed me that everyone has pain, and that it's okay to talk about it. You taught me that being strong doesn't mean hiding your feelings. Frank's vision blurred with tears as he looked at the drawing. He remembered the first time he'd seen her artwork, that initial sketch of him on his motorcycle that had started their unlikely friendship. When I'm scared now, I remember what you told me about your wife, Lily said softly. How you learned that love doesn't go away just because someone does, and how helping others can heal your own heart. Her grandparents moved to sit closer to her, and Lily reached out to hold their hands. I want you all to know that I love you, she said, her voice clear and steady. And I'm not afraid anymore. I know you won't leave me. Frank stood up slowly, his legs feeling unsteady with emotion. He walked over to Lily and knelt beside her wheelchair. Lily, he said, his gruff voice thick with feeling, I am so proud of you. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. You've shown more courage than most adults I know. Watching you grow, seeing you face your fears, it's been amazing. Lily threw her arms around Frank's neck, hugging him tightly. Frank held her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace and the weight of this moment. In this little girl's courage, he saw the reflection of his own healing, of wounds slowly mending through love and connection. You're the bravest person I know, Frank whispered, his voice rough with emotion. And I couldn't be prouder of the person you're becoming. The evening sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as Frank sat at the familiar wooden table with Lily and her grandparents. The smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air, and the gentle hum of the ceiling fan created a peaceful atmosphere. Lily sat in her purple wheelchair, her latest sketchbook open in front of her, filled with colorful drawings of motorcycles and flowers. So, sweetheart, her grandmother said, placing a glass of milk next to Lily's cookies. Are you excited about starting 4th grade next month? Lily nodded, but Frank noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. He'd gotten better at reading her expressions over the past few months. What's on your mind, kiddo? He asked gently. Lily fiddled with her pencil, her eyes fixed on her drawing. What if the other kids don't understand? About my wheelchair and everything? Her grandfather reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Remember what we learned in therapy? It's okay to be nervous, but we're all here to support you. Frank leaned forward, his weathered face softening. You know what? I was thinking maybe I could give you a ride to school sometimes on special days. In my truck, of course, he added quickly, seeing her grandparents' concerned looks. We could work out a schedule that works for everyone. Lily's face lit up. Really? You'd do that? Of course, Frank said, his voice warm and steady. And I'll be around to help with homework too, if you want. Math might not be my strong suit, but I've got plenty of life experience to share. Her grandmother wiped away a tear, trying to hide it behind her coffee cup. Frank, you've become such a blessing to this family. I don't know where we'd be without you. The words touched something deep in Frank's heart. He remembered those lonely days at the diner, before Lily had wheeled into his life. How empty everything had felt, how purposeless. Now, sitting here with this family that had somehow become his own, he felt whole. Again. We should talk about setting up a routine, her grandfather suggested, pulling out a calendar. Between therapy sessions, school, and doctor's appointments, we'll need to coordinate. As they discussed the logistics of the upcoming school year, Frank watched Lily adding details to her drawing. She was sketching what looked like 4 people standing together, her grandparents, herself, and a tall figure that could only be him. "That's beautiful, Lily," he said softly. She looked up at him with those wise eyes that had first caught his attention months ago. "It's my family," she said simply. The word family echoed in Frank's mind, filling spaces he thought would stay empty forever. He cleared his throat, fighting back emotion. "Listen," he said, looking at each of them in turn. "I want you all to know something. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes up, whatever challenges we face, I'll be here. That's a promise." Lily's grandmother reached out and patted his hand, while her grandfather nodded appreciatively. But it was Lily's smile that meant everything. Bright and genuine, without a trace of the fear that used to shadow her face. "I know," Lily said, adding the final touches to her drawing. "That's why I drew you right here, next to me." Frank sat on a weathered park bench, his leather jacket creased from years of wear, watching as Lily pedaled her specially adapted bicycle around the park's winding path. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and a gentle breeze carried the sound of children's laughter. Her purple helmet matched her old wheelchair, which now spent more time in storage than in use. 2 of her friends from therapy group rode alongside her, their bikes weaving playfully back and forth. Frank's heart swelled as he heard Lily's clear, confident voice ring out across the playground. "Race you to the big oak tree." He remembered the day they'd first tried the adaptive bike. Lily had been terrified, her small hands gripping the handlebars so tight her knuckles turned white. "I can't do it," she'd whispered, tears threatening to spill. But Frank had stayed beside her, one hand steadying the bike, his voice gentle but firm. "You're stronger than you know, kiddo. I'm right here." Now, watching her confident turns and easy smile, Frank could hardly believe she was the same girl who'd approached his table at the diner all those months ago. Her shoulders, once hunched with worry, were now straight and proud. Her eyes, which used to dart nervously around the room, now met people's gazes with warmth and curiosity. One of Lily's friends called out to her, and she responded with a burst of giggles that carried across the park. The sound made Frank's chest tighten with emotion. He'd forgotten what it felt like to care this deeply about someone, to have his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Mrs. Chen, one of the other parents, settled onto the bench beside him. "She's come so far," she said softly, watching the children play. "You've made such a difference in her life, Frank." Frank shook his head, his voice gruff with emotion. "She's the one who changed me." He watched as Lily expertly navigated around a corner, her face lit up with joy. "I was just a lonely old biker before I met her. Didn't know what I was missing." The late afternoon light painted everything in soft gold, catching the spokes of Lily's wheel as she made another loop around the path. Her grandparents had told him just yesterday how much calmer she seemed now, how she'd started talking about her mother without that edge of panic in her voice. The therapy was working, but Frank knew it was more than that. It was love. Plain and simple. The kind of love that heals and transforms. Lily spotted him on the bench and waved enthusiastically, nearly losing her balance but catching herself with the skill of practice. "Watch this, Frank," she called out, demonstrating a new turning technique she'd learned. Frank raised his hand in acknowledgement, his heart so full he could barely speak. This was what he'd been missing all those years on the road, trying to outrun his grief. This was what healing looked like, not in dramatic moments, but in quiet afternoons watching a child grow stronger, braver, happier. As Lily's laughter echoed across the park again, Frank felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The weight of loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years had lifted, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more precious. He watched as Lily continued to ride, her face glowing with joy, surrounded by friends who accepted her exactly as she was. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.